Hi, everyone. Welcome to Oakland. I want to thank the organizers for this session for bringing us onto my favorite platform, Zoom. And also want to thank the AACC for being really generous with sharing resources that they have on the FS Louie company. So the project that, oh, and thank you to Kelly for being here. Originally, Kelly was not going to be able to be involved in any of this because it was going to be in Pennsylvania. So shout out to Kelly as well. All right. The project we discussed today is a contemporary archaeological study of a business, the FS Louie Restaurant Supply Company of Fong S. Louie and his wife, Wai-Su Chun Louie. The company operated out of Berkeley, California, beginning around 1952 and declined after Fong's death in 1993. The FS Louie Company should be understood as the materialization of a particular moment in the Chinese diasporic experience. It was an enterprise that contributed to multiple expressions of what it was to be Chinese and American in the second half of the 20th century. We see our project in conversation with Laura Ng's work on transnational diasporic identities, while also explicitly examining the influence of political and ideological transformations in China on its transnational population in the 20th century. While some surviving business records for FS Louie are accessible at the Asian American Comparative Collection at the University of Idaho, the most compelling business archive is the assemblage of restaurant ceramics. As one of only two known Chinese American distributors of restaurant wares working in the mid-20th century, the wares offered by the Louies and their San Francisco-based competitor, the Ying Trading Company, look very different from ceramics otherwise sold to Chinese American restaurants in the continental US. Born in 1897, Fong Louie first came to the US in 1913, traveling from Toisan to Hong Kong and arriving in San Francisco. Louie completed high school in Reno and attended the University of Nevada, graduating with a BS in chemical engineering in 1928. By studying engineering, Louie situated himself firmly among a generation of US-educated Chinese American transnationals. Inspired by the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the push for Chinese democracy, students sought educational credentials that would contribute to the modernization efforts of China. Louie then traveled to Columbia University for graduate school, joining a range of young intellectuals and activists from the Chinese diaspora. It was there that his path first crossed that of Wai-Su Chun. Wai-Su Chun was born in 1905 on Oahu to a Chinese American merchant family who ran a clothing and sundries business in Honolulu. Wai-Su completed a degree at the University of Hawaii before going to Columbia for a graduate degree in nutrition. Wai-Su Chun and Fong Louie's romantic relationship did not begin at Columbia, but in China. In 1931, after visiting her brother at Yenching University in Beijing, Wai-Su was offered and accepted a teaching position in home economics at Hubei Normal College in Tianjin. Fong Louie, who was in China working as an engineer for the government, found Wai-Su in Tianjin through a fraternity brother from Columbia. The two decided to marry in 1932. The couple built their family while contributing to the construction of China, navigating the turmoil of the Japanese invasion, World War II, moving between business opportunities and university positions in Kunming, Hong Kong, and Canton. With the communist takeover in 1949, however, the family decided to relocate to the US. While Wai-Su had US citizenship, Louie's request for citizenship was not granted until 1954, by which time the family had bought a home in Berkeley, California, and were several years into their Chinese restaurant supply venture. The business grew from conversations with restaurant owners who described difficulties accessing decent new ceramics. Drawing on Wai-Su family's merchant connections, the Louies imported restaurant wares manufactured in Japan, but decorated with recognizably Chinese patterns. Their business allowed them to take advantage of low tariffs for Japanese goods entering the US, part of the US's effort to rebuild Japan's economy after the war. They also sidestepped agreements made between US restaurant ceramic manufacturers to not purchase cheaper Japanese wares. The Louies definitely created a unique niche for themselves in the restaurant supply that grew out of their specific transnational diasporic experiences and connections. Before the Ying Company and the Louies opened their businesses, Chinese American restaurateurs purchased personalized American, British, or German manufactured ceramics through white American ceramic distributors. Surviving examples of Chinese restaurant wares from the 1920s show that F.F. de Bolt, O'Connor and McPherson, the Botel brothers, and George M. Bowman were among the distributors who supplied the growing Chinese American populations of Chicago and Detroit with tablewares from companies like Shenango, Meyer, Lamberton, and Bauscher. By the mid-1930s, recognizing the economic potential of the growing popularity of the so-called chop suey restaurants, U.S. restaurantware manufacturers like Buffalo China, Hall, and Sterling began to explicitly market vessel forms and patterns for Chinese American restaurants. Many of the shapes were modifications of existing Anglo vessels, such as custard bowls renamed as handleless teacups. New vessel forms like the war and the chop suey dish were invented by U.S. ceramic manufacturers for Chinese American restaurants. 3 transfer printed patterns, Willow, Delph, and Hummingbird, came to dominate U.S. manufacturers' offerings to Chinese American consumers through the 1970s. Most of the large U.S. manufacturers made versions of these patterns, which, like the vessel forms, had little to no aesthetic connection to Chinese ceramic traditions. By the late 1940s in New York City, 2 restaurant distributors catered to the large Chinatown community: Cook's Restaurant Supply and York's Restaurant Supply, which sold mainly Hall, Sterling, and Buffalo China to New York's Chinese American restaurants. In contrast, the Louies offered very different looking wares. In their 1960 catalog, 4 primary patterns were depicted: luster, woman/characters, bird flowers, and dragon phoenix for restaurant use. These were decorated with overglazed stamps and hand painting. By 1983, Louie discontinued luster, but was offering a red dragon pattern to his customers. The 1983 catalog also features a new decal pattern, Longevity, a joint venture between Sterling China and F.S. Louie. While the company primarily offered imported wares, the inclusion of made in the U.S. ceramics and the stamping of these vessels with a union label mark speaks to the business acumen of the Louies. As they had earlier in their career, they carefully navigated international and national politics. Sometime after the 1983 catalog, the company started to offer ashtrays, featuring Shouxing, one of the immortals associated with long life. The patterns offered by the Louies include at least 2 with explicit ties to the Chinese Democratic Republic, predating communist takeover. The Dragon Phoenix pattern features the mythological pairing of phoenix and dragon and the flaming pearl the 2 protected, surrounded by a blue, red, and yellow thunder border pattern. The flag associated with Sun Yat-sen's Republic of China, known as the Kinta flag, and used until 1928, featured the colors representing the 5 ethnic groups of China: red for the Han, yellow for the Manchurians, blue for the Mongolians, white for the Tibetans, and black for the Muslims. The 12 symbols' national emblem included phoenix and dragon. Ceramics identical to those sold by the Louie Company were produced in China, and the configuration of the dragon phoenix with the multiple colored thunder pattern is most often accompanied with Republic-era marks. The pattern 2 women characters has specific resonances with the cultural movement of 1918. The Chinese characters associated with this pattern translate as precious like jade, a common expression comparing beauty, aka a woman, to jade. The phrase also nods to a famous literary character, Jia Baoyu, who is one of the 3 central characters of The Dream of the Red Chamber. This classic work of Chinese literature was first attributed to the authorship of the 18th century noble Cao Shuaiqin as part of the cultural moment of 1918. The 2 women in this pattern also represent characters from Dream of the Red Chamber. Lin Daiyu, the cousin of Baoyu, loves the Shui Baochu, the cousin he is expected to marry. So there's 2 women, one he loves, one he's supposed to marry. The book was heralded as a critique of Chinese feudalism, as well as a condemnation of how women were traditionally treated in China. If you'll note, one of the women holds a scroll. I don't know if you can see this. There we go. On her lap, evoking the importance of education for women in the Republican government. This pattern, representing a scene in the Grand View Garden, appears on Republic period teapots and teacups with a variety of quotes from the book. The plantain leaves always feature very prominently and only seem to appear during this period. The book was originally much beloved by Mao, but was later banned by his government, making its continued popular representation on Chinese American restaurant wares notable. The FS Louie catalog gives no sense of how popular any of the patterns were to consumers. This can be reconstructed, we think, from a combined study of company marks and the restaurants the company sold to. Examples of all the major patterns, as well as one pinkware, have been identified with Louie marks. In 1960, images from the catalog show that the business used a 4-character chop mark, 2 slightly different variations have been found, and a single mun character. The chop mark extols the brilliance and quality of goods offered under the mun character. In Chinese, mun has a number of meanings, including art and culture, an apt designation for Louie's products when understood in the context of Louie's transnational and political subject positions. Trademark registration records show that in 1972, the company registered a mark based on a stylized thunder character, or the character for the name Louie in Cantonese. One defining feature of a significant subset of Louie's wares has made our project possible: the inclusion of varying combinations of restaurant name, street address, city name, and phone number. This attribute of an unknown proportion of Louie's wares brings an archaeological dimension to the project. We are undertaking a sustained search to identify through internet, archival, and museum collections as many Louie supplied restaurants as possible. To date, we have identified 173 restaurants in 28 states plus the District of Columbia. With the aid of PhD student Jeffrey Seckinger, we are building a GIS database to understand the temporal geographies of the Louie's business. We are identifying as many of the restaurant owners, their relationships to other restaurant families, and their family histories and the history of race relations in Chinese diaspora communities in particular regions. We found intriguing overlaps with Laura Ng's examination of restaurants in Southern California associated with the families of the Gomben village in Toisan. And looking for the further connections between families who are connected to one another through their businesses. Look at me with my problematic paper. Through their business relationships with the Louies, we are attempting to recapture some of the ties that knotted together diasporic webs. Finally, we are interested in the infrapolitics of the ceramics. Customers intentionally modified Louie's wares to their own preferences through font choice, removal of particular design elements, and the inclusion or exclusion of Chinese characters or additional designs. We briefly introduced 2 examples today: Hong Kong Restaurant of Champaign, Illinois, and the Sun Restaurant of Washington, D.C. Hong Kong Restaurant was run by George and Jean Chin, who fled the communist government in 1949. Their ceramics feature the cringeworthy words "compliments of," suggesting the plate was intended as a gift. This example of self-orientalizing is seen in menus and matchbooks of several of the restaurants, but not on their ceramics. The plate, which bears Louie's early chop mark, dates close to the 1949 opening of the restaurant and speaks to one strategy for navigating a potentially racialized hostile environment while building a successful business dependent upon those who may harbor racism toward you. In a 2009 interview on the occasion of the erection of a large mortuary monument honoring generations of her family, Jean Chin alluded to the tremendous educational and economic success her children and grandchildren have enjoyed in the US. For her family, the strategy was successful. The Sun Restaurant in Washington, D.C. speaks to a different mode of communication. The restaurant was founded in 1928, 3 years after the death of Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Republic of China. The logo for the restaurant features a sun that corresponds to the sun on the 1928 redesigned Chinese Republic flag, as well as the sun that appears on the interior ceiling of Sun's mausoleum in Nanjing. In addition, the characters on the teacup include the name by which Sun was first known in Japan and then more commonly known in China, Sun Zhongshan. In the case of the Sun Restaurant, the teacup communicated a political orientation and allegiance through the parts of its design not accessible to non-Chinese patrons. While these are just 2 examples, we've seen a number of ways that the choices of restaurant names and logos speak to the materialization of a specifically Cantonese and democratically oriented transnational diaspora in the mid to late 20th century. The Louie's business has left archaeological traces, scattered in thrift stores, restaurant cabinets, museum and archival collections, and antique stalls. Individually, they are evocative. They speak to the histories of individual restaurants and family experiences of a time when opportunities for Chinese Americans were extremely limited and restaurant management and ownership represented the best economic opportunities. Assembled, They materialize the complex transnational webs that constitute a particular moment in the Chinese diaspora. Diaspora memorialized on a teacup. Thank you.